Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second event in our three-part speaker series, We Shall Not Be Silent, a conversation on race in America. Thank you for zooming in. I'm Rabbi Michael of Congregation Shirat Hayam here in Swampscott, Massachusetts, where I'm blessed by and grateful for the work of Tzedek LaKol, Justice for All, our team focused on achieving racial and social justice within our congregation and community. Let me offer a thought to focus us this afternoon. Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, fill us with gratitude that we are present for this important conversation. Open our hearts to the reality which we witness and make our ears attentive to the truth which we hear, and let us say, Amen. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi. For those joining us from across the North Shore and elsewhere, we want to introduce ourselves as conveners of this event. Located in Swampscott, Massachusetts, Congregation Shirat Hayam offers multiple pathways to Jewish life, learning, and prayer, so that all may feel welcomed, connected, and enriched.
Tzedek LaKol, Justice for All, is a Shirat Hayam member-led group who organized in October of 2020 in response to ongoing issues of racial and social justice facing our country. We focus on achieving racial and social justice within our congregation and community, and are committed to collaborating with others through action and educational programs, confronting injustices and pursuing equal and equitable rights for all.
Today's event, What Does Judaism Teach Us About Racial Justice?, marks the second in our three-part speaker series called We Shall Not Be Silent, Conversations on Race. Our series focuses and centers these necessary conversations by examining racism and racial justice through national, Jewish, and local lenses. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Our event will include 30 to 45 minutes of discussion, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of audience Q&A. Attendees may submit their questions using the Q&A function in the webinar. Questions will be screened by a member of our committee and provided to our moderator to ask during the Q&A session. This event is being recorded and streamed live on Shirat Hayam's Facebook page. The recording will also be posted to the Shirat Hayam website after the event. Without further ado, let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Amy Gold. A Shirat Hayam member, Amy has been the head of school at Epstein Hillel School in Marblehead since 2015. I had the good fortune of working with Amy for 7 years before my retirement last year. Amy, we're thrilled to have you here with us this afternoon to help us explore how racial justice aligns with our Jewish value of tikkun olam, repairing the world.
Thanks, Barbara. That is a lovely introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here with everyone this afternoon for what I know will be a really interesting and stimulating conversation. So to get us started, I have the pleasure and honor of having this time to talk with our featured speaker, who is Rabbi Tiferet Berenbaum. Rabbi Tiferet Berenbaum is the rabbi of Congregational Learning and Programming at Temple Beth Zion in Brookline. She received her non-denominational rabbinic training from Hebrew College in Newton, as well as her master's degree in Jewish education. After college, she spent 6 years deeply immersed in Torah, Talmud, Midrash, Halakha, practical rabbinics, Hebrew, and Aramaics at Hebrew College, obviously very busy. She spent her summers in the New England Berkshires, living, growing, teaching, and serving at the Isabella Friedman Jewish Retreat Center. She's taught at numerous synagogues and day schools, as well as directing summer camp and establishing an independent youth program. Rabbi Tiferet previously served for 4 years in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Congregation Shirat Hayam, a Reconstructionist congregation. She formerly served as the rabbi and education director at Temple Beth Zion in Mount Holly, New Jersey. She is currently pursuing a doctorate in educational leadership at Lesley University, where she plans to investigate the significance of race to Jews in America. She exudes a joyous and enlivened expression of Judaism. She has a strong passion for working with children and a deep commitment to connection across generations and across communities. Rabbi Tiferet captivates with her warmth, knowledge, and beautiful singing voice. In her multifaceted career, she has had a front seat at the intersection of race, racism, and religion, giving her very valuable insights into how different groups of people see the world and refining her powers of empathy. I am especially excited to be speaking with Rav Tiferet also because I have a personal connection to Temple Beth Zion. I actually was married by the founding rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Waldox. So I was a member at Temple Beth Zion. So it's a very special community, and I'm really happy to share this with you and be able to talk together. So I wanted to see if there's anything before we jump into the questions, I didn't know if Rav Tiferet, if there's anything you wanted to just sort of say as an opening beginning, or we can jump right in, completely up to you.
Sure. I just like to say, first of all, thank you so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I did not fully write that bio. Someone else wrote it, in case you were thinking, oh, what chutzpah, she's sitting here talking about her lovely singing. Someone else wrote that for me.
Great. So why don't we can jump on in. And I was thinking about this too. And I was thinking about this idea that when you talk about Judaism and you talk about race and you talk about where those pieces come together and how we understand how we need to treat each other, really, that's really what this is all about, whether it's religion or color of skin or what people's beliefs are. It all comes down to this idea of how do we understand human interaction with each other. And Judaism has so much to teach us about that. And one of the things that inspired me very much in some of the learning that I've done is actually a quote that comes from Pirkei Avot and from Rabbi Hillel. And one of the things that he says is that he says, "B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel liot ish." In a place where there are no people, strive to be a person. And to me, I feel like that's such a beautiful framing for the conversation that we're going to have today, is how do we see each other, right? And how do we treat each other? And are you looking at the outside or the inside of who we are? So kind of with that opening, I'll kick us off into some of our more formal questions, which will, I'm sure, have other follow-up ones as well. But to get everyone a little familiar with your experience growing up, you went to an all-white high school. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what were the messages that you received about your racial identity in that setting, and what are some of your earliest memories about being different than that high school and all of your classmates and schoolmates?
Sure. So I find this a really fascinating question. I took out my yearbooks to reflect on my experiences in high school and who my classmates were. And I calculated the percentage of students of color in those classes, and it came out to be about 18 to 20% students of color, which feels to me like a significant number. But numbers don't tell the whole story, right? Numbers tell us the quantity, not the quality.
Sure.
So, what was the experience like for students of color, and what was my experience as a student of color? That's what I've come to reflect on, especially now that I'm actually coming up on my 20th high school reunion this year. But even in college, it was quite diverse in terms of numbers as well. Yet I still felt discomfort, and I couldn't identify what that discomfort was until much later in my studies when I started learning about the Supreme Court's decision of Brown versus the Board of Education back in 1954 to integrate schools. And in thinking about what school integration meant, it basically meant that people of color and white people could learn together. Now, in segregated schools, Black students were taught by teachers that looked like them, that shared cultural values with them, that believed in their abilities and were able to help them thrive even though the schools were under-resourced. They still had those rich resources internally. With school integration, students of color were now learning from teachers that didn't look like them, in class with people who didn't share their cultural values. And in addition, teachers received no training about how to create a learning environment now made up of different cultures, values, and perspectives, nor were the students prepared for this shift. And so, back when Brown versus the Board of Education went through, those students were entering hostile environments. Now, by the 90s, when I was in high school, way back then, students of color were entering hostile at worst, unconscious at best learning environments. And so I would classify my high school experience as one of unconscious bias, unconsciously biased towards whiteness, which showed up in a lot of ways, with reading all white authors, except when I had a Black teacher who let us read Black authors, being taught the historical perspective from a white narrative, and being immersed in a school culture that sees not white as other, both in through the curriculum and in interaction. So that sent the message that we students who weren't white were also other, right? If there were tokens in the curriculum, then it was like we were tokens in the community. And not a part of it. And I should say, I certainly don't resent my high school experience for this. Like I'm already registered for all of the reunion events. And I'm really grateful for these experiences and to be mindful of them and critical of them at this point in my life.
Sure. How, so sort of following up on that in the arc of, how you've come today from high school and then into your professional career, what would you say are some of the changes that you've seen so far in, sort of growing up in America and then starting into the working world school? And, what are the changes that you've seen so far in your lifetime for communities of color?
So in terms of race, we are all socialized to messages about race. And I think a lot of people think about race and racial experiences as something that only people of color have and think about and experience. And that in itself is a message that we've received about race, right? That race is something that people of color experience. So I often get questions like, what are my earliest memories of race? But I think the more important question for our collective growth is, what are the first memories of race for white people? Because people of color always have to think about race and experience and experience the world racially, whereas white people often do not, or it's at least not in their consciousness. Because whiteness is the norm in America, it tends to be invisible. So it's far more fascinating to me to wonder when a white person began to notice their race. Now, studies show that children as young as 3 and 4 can recognize skin color differences, but race is about more than that. Race is about power and access. So I wonder when people who experience whiteness discovered that they were experiencing the world in a fundamentally different way from people of color. And I know that there are adults today who still cannot process that their experience is not the universal American experience. But for people who have had those experiences of recognizing that there is that difference, it's in those moments that I wonder, did you keep pulling back the veil to see what's really there, or did you cover it up and look away, right? And it's like really looking at what led to those choices. And there's a great paper by a Swedish researcher, Gunnar Myrdal, I believe is how his name is pronounced. And it was published in the 1940s, where he concluded that there was a lot of conversation around the Negro problem. And so he concluded that like the Negro problem was really a problem of whiteness and the idea of whiteness's inability to coexist with the espoused values of American equality, freedom, and opportunity. So with all of that as the problem, the biggest change that I've seen in my short lifetime is that more white people are pulling back the veil and seeing what's really there. And I think more people are willing to see that racism isn't about name calling or, singular events, but it's a system that creates barriers for people of color, which when looked at in isolation can be bad, maybe not that bad, people might say, but when taken collectively, clearly point to a systemic problem. And more white people are able to see that seeing whiteness and seeing systemic racism, it's like the pill, taking the pill in the Matrix. I love the Matrix. It's one of my favorite movies. But once you take that pill, right, once you leave the Matrix, you can't go back into that unconsciousness that people who are still in the Matrix have. So once you look fully behind the veil, you can't unsee it. And that's why, when I hear people complaining, well, everything's about race and racism now, right? It's because once the pattern is shown to you and you can see it and understand it, you can't not see it because like the Matrix, it's fundamental.
So it's fascinating to me about what you said about this idea that for many people, for white people, don't realize that it's about understanding that their view is different than everybody else's because they're part of a larger majority. And I wonder, this is sort of where there's that intersectionality of being Jews in America, that we are such a smaller portion of the entire population of, the United States. And that is that moment of feeling the other. So I'm wondering if you can say a few words kind of about the intersectionality there of that experience, of where race and racism come with Judaism and feeling anti-Semitism.
For me personally?
Sure, you can start there.
Sure. So in thinking about the intersectionality of racism and anti-Semitism, I'm really blessed because I don't experience many events of racism and anti-Semitism to my face. Thank God. I've had a few experiences of anti-Semitism. I was there's one story. The rest of them happened behind my back. So I'll tell the first story that happened to my face. I was on my way somewhere, and it was Easter morning, and I was on the bus, and the bus driver turns around and he's like, well, why aren't you in church right now? And I was like, sir, I'm Jewish. It just happens to be Sunday and I'm trying to go somewhere. And he was like, no, you're not. And he just couldn't handle it. And he was yelling at me. I had to get off the bus. It was terrible. And then I called the ADL. That's really the only experience of anti-Semitism that I've had to my face. I was told by another family member that, I was invited for Thanksgiving, and one of my cousins said, why is she coming for Thanksgiving? Because I'm the only Jewish person in my family. And, my uncle said, because that's your cousin. Of course, that's your family. And so that happened behind my back. And so I've discovered that a lot of things are probably happening behind my back because that's how racism and anti-Semitism work. So I recently learned of a story that, it wasn't, of course, how would I have known? Someone died in Milwaukee, and they went to the funeral home and they said, I'm looking for a rabbi. My father was really progressive and, et cetera, et cetera. And they were like, well, they're going through rabbis. And they're like, well, we have this other rabbi. And, the woman was like, okay, great. She sounds wonderful. And they're like, yeah. Or they said something like, well, she's a woman. And he was like, yeah, that's fine. Like, I was looking for a woman. They were like, well, okay. And so, the woman was like, why are they being so weird? This is so bizarre. And so when I arrived to officiate the funeral, it was like, oh, they were being weird because she was Black, So it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Like, how many times and that's how racism works. Like, nobody was going to say, well, we have a rabbi, but she's Black,
Right.
So it's just the pause and the maybe and the tone and right. So I'm sure there's a lot of that I am not aware of. But I'm an educator, and I really truly believe that we can heal racism and anti-Semitism and really all of the isms, because I believe they're so firmly tied together. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later, heal it through education. And I know not everyone agrees with me. But I try to come from the place as an educator.
Right.
When I encounter anti-Semitism online, a friend of mine who's, he posted something that through the lack of nuance in the language could be perceived. I perceived it as anti-Semitic, and I certainly I know that wasn't their intention. So I just broke it down with no judgment. I'm not calling you an anti-Semite. I'm just, let me show you how these things could be perceived as anti-Semitic and why these things are problematic and how this is not true, which was well received.
Yeah, those are the microaggressions, right? That if we just ignore them, it's a problem. And so people need to, you need to shine a light and say, let me show you why this might not feel good to somebody else because of what it's saying underneath the surface. Yeah. So there was a study that was done in 2019. There was an analysis conducted by the Jews of Color, which initiative, which estimates the Jews of Color represent about 12 to 15% of American Jews. And I'm just, wondering, kind of continuing on in the conversation that we've had about, as a rabbi, what other messages, you've given us a few, but, so do you hear or do you receive about race in the Jewish community specifically?
Well, unfortunately, I hear and receive the same messages as in the greater world, which makes me sad. Some Jews have become white in America, right? Certainly not all Jews are white. Some Jews have become white in America, and not all Jews have thought critically about what that means, right? And again, race is not just about skin color, it's about power, access, and privilege. So when some Jews became white in America, they experienced privilege, inclusion, access, really that Jews in modern society had been dreaming of since the Enlightenment, right? It's like, we made it. But my experience has been that many Jews have felt absolved of anti-racism work for a number of reasons. Well, one, they don't understand race, and we've been socialized not to understand race. So there's certainly no fault there, right? They don't understand race and how it applies to them. It could be their families came here after slavery, right? And so racism is something associated with slavery. So they don't understand how it applies to them now. Or 3, they stood up for civil rights, or at least Abraham Joshua Heschel did. And I always joke, everyone's like, he yotzed everyone's chiyuv, right? He fulfilled everyone's obligation. So those are the 3 things that I encounter. And so, the statistic that you quoted from the Jewish of Color Field Initiative, I've heard it broken down that equals 1 in 7. I trust that that's true because I'm terrible at math, but that 1 in 7 means that there should be a Jew of color in every minyan, right? Yeah. But that's not the reality. So the question is, of course, why is that? And I recently read this really good research about some of the strategies that Black women use to become successful in the white male dominated world of academia. And one of those strategies was finding refuge in their churches. And unfortunately, for Jews of color, synagogues aren't places of refuge from the demands and the harassments of the racialized world. It's often more of the same, more messages that we don't belong. such as like, oh, how are you Jewish, right? Like as if the answer to that question is necessarily different from how the questioner became Jewish, as in my parents are Jewish, right? Like I was raised Jewish, right? And like even doing that assumes that that a Jew of color is an other, right? There, you must have a fundamentally different story than I do. Right? And even if that was a person who chose Judaism, right? Someone who was not born Jewish, one's personal spiritual journey is a kiddush conversation, right? Like I would hope that someone in conversation with a trans person, like over egg salad on a bagel, would never say something like, oh, that's cool. So what made you become trans? Right? Like even thinking about that, it's like, oh my God, like who would say that? And I feel like it's a very similar thing. If we could only get to that same like shock and disbelief about, you know, questioning Jews of color, I'd say we've arrived somewhere.
Yeah, it's so interesting the point you make, because no one would ever talk to someone else and sort of question like, well, how often do you go to shul? You know, so like you must be really Jewish, you know, like asking them, you know, sort of like, did you used to go twice a year or did you go 10 times a year? You know, no one would ever spark that conversation about questioning someone's level of how Jewish are you, but it comes out only because of, you know, of being Black versus being white. You know, it's a presumption that is so inaccurate.
Can I tell you it's a very short story. There was someone who came to TBZ for the first time. I had never seen this person there. I confirmed they were not a member. They had not, right? Like this was their first time there. And it was kiddush. And so the person says to me, they're like, oh, well, I've never seen you here before. Have you been here before? And I was like, yes, I have. And they're like, oh, that's so great. Well, what do you do? I said, I'm a rabbi. And they were like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. Where are you a rabbi? I said, here. Right? It's like, so yeah, it's all about like that need to interrogate. And like this person was gatekeeping in my own home, right? Like, what are you doing?
Oh, gosh. So I guess, okay, so I'll move us forward a little bit. I would love to, do you want to, you know, can you think of any sort of slice of Torah or just a, you know, al regel echad, sort of like on one foot, you know, where do you sort of get your messages from Torah about race and justice? You know, sort of like where, I mean, I know there are so many different, as a day school person, I could, you know, there's lots of sources, but maybe for all of the folks who are joining us right now, can you maybe give us a little taste of where you like get your strength from and your inspiration from Torah when we think about treating people, you know, equally and the same, and thinking about justice for, you know, for all people?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is like, I tend to not talk about treating people equally, right? Because it's really about how we think and how we perceive. So I would never, treating people equally means everyone gets a piece of paper in a 12-point font, right? When clearly someone over here like needs a 20-point font. Mm-hmm. I've had students who really need, right? Like, and making sure of like what everyone needs. Because I think equality is also a challenging concept that we've been led to believe is a good thing, mm-hmm. Which allows the erasure of difference, meaning in the differences that people experience. Mm. So when I think about race and justice in the Torah, it's also really important for me to acknowledge that race did not exist when the Torah was given, because race didn't really exist until white colonizers needed a reason to justify enslaving brown people. So like, that's pretty recent. So race, we have to sort of read into the stories and make the connections to our lives and to understand what the Torah tells us and how the Torah can give us guidance in thinking about our modern problems. And this process, it's not a disingenuous process. That is the process of keeping Torah as Torah Chaim, both Torah that is alive and relevant and changing, and Torah for our lives, right? Mm-hmm. Torah that we can live by. Mm-hmm. So as I said, racism is like the matrix, right? Like once you see it, you can't not see it. So when I look at Torah, I can see correlations and teachings about racism everywhere, right? As it says in the Mishnah, Torah keneged kulam, right? Like there's Torah for everything. But there are these two really important things that I want to offer. So the first one is from Leviticus 19:6, Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, right? Don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. And I appreciate this piece of Torah for a lot of reasons. One, it says neighbor and not your brother, right? So that gives us a little bit of leeway. I often hear people when they're thinking about racism, it's like, well, this is about other people, right? This isn't about us, right? Which is completely erasing Jews of color. So this is guidance towards your neighbor, right? Like the Torah could have said achicha, the Torah could have said your brother, but it chose not to give a wider context for who are we living amongst. And for now, like now in our contexts, our neighbors are varied. It also says, lo ta'amod, like don't stand by. It doesn't say, don't be silent about, right? Which would lead us to think that the Torah is calling us to speak up about the blood of our neighbors. It's saying, and it's not saying don't be ignorant about, right? Which would make us think that the action that's being called for is to do some deeper learning. But it's saying, lo ta'amod, like don't stand still in the face of the dam of your neighbor, like in the face of the blood of your neighbor, right? So the Torah is saying you have to move, you have to act. The only wrong thing to do is nothing, right? So I'm wondering, like, oh, this series is called "We Shall Not Be Silent." Maybe it should be called like "We Shall Not Be Still," right? In the face of racism, we're going to act. And I think that's really important because I have seen a lot of communities who have had like learnings around racism, conversations. And it's like, okay, no, so what, right? So what do you do with it, right? Pirkei Avot teaches us that knowledge without action is like a tree with shallow roots, right? And like shallow roots, the trees are on their own, right? If a big wind blows, they're gonna fall over, right? Like if someone comes and says like, oh, like we're focusing too much on racism or blah, 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 right? The tree will fall over, right? It's like, okay, you're right. But trees with deep roots, right? And the actions leading to the deep roots, trees then root graft. I love the idea of root grafting. And the roots get connected, right? You want deep roots because they can access deeper, and I think about that as accessing deeper soil means thinking more critically and being connected to other trees who are doing the same work. So we don't feel so alone and getting strength from that connection. So lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. The other piece of Torah that I think is really important is thinking about the characters of Moses and Aharon, right? So Moses, just like, how much time do I have? Like, I could get carried away. I'm going to like really try to be chick-chock about this because
No, you're good. You're good. This is all, I mean, there's so much. So this is like your teaching. Okay. So I love it. Keep going.
I love thinking about Moses. So Moses was an Israelite who didn't know he was an Israelite, raised in Pharaoh's palace, right?
Yeah.
And then one day, Moses is able to see the Matrix, right? And he's like, oh my God, how are you treating the Israelites like this? Right? And like, then he like recognizes that he's an Israelite and it's like, oh my God. And then he goes off into the wilderness, right? And then God comes and plucks him out because God only lets people run away from their duties for so long. That God came and got him out of the wilderness and said, you need to go to Pharaoh. Now, wait a minute. What other Israelite would be able to just waltz into the palace? Right? Like Moses had this incredible privilege and God was saying, you need to use your privilege and you need to stand up and do something. And then Moses was like, really?
I'm not a good choice for this, right?
I know. Like, maybe you should ask someone else. Like, who else? Who else, Moses, is going to be able to go in and stand up and speak to the needs? But God said, you'll have, Aharon with you. And so I've often thought about like this partnership between Moses and Aaron. Like, well, if Aharon was the speaker, like, why didn't God just tell, Aharon, empower him to go in and do it? And if God's making, miracles out of people, just turn Aharon into a miracle. And like, why was it necessary for both of them? Well, the Midrash tells us, God bless the Midrash, all the answers. The Midrash tells us that while Moses was off tending sheep and living in Midian, Aharon was there with the people, right? For 40 years, Aharon was a prophet for the Israelites. And he was there, boots on the ground. So Aharon had the street cred, to like help Moses help the Israelites. So I think this is really important Torah for justice work, to remember that we are in partnership at all times. And there are people who have their feet on the ground, right? There, as much as we want to come in and say like, I know it's best and I have the power, because Moses did have the power, but Aharon was in the fight longer, right? And Aharon knew what the people needed, and he had a relationship with the people. So it had to be Moses and Aharon going together to bring the people towards freedom. It couldn't be one or the other. It had to be both of them using their privileges. Moses with his, power and access to the system, and Aharon with his knowledge and connections to the people.
That is a perfect segue. I love that. And I love this idea of that nobody can do it on their own, right? Like you need a partner. And I love that, people always think of Moses as the great leader, but he was only so strong by looking out and being, saying, I need help. And that's a great model for all of us. As we think of the Passover story, having just ended and we're heading towards Shavuot, I wonder, sort of like bringing us into current times also, and thinking about, all of what we've been reading about, sadly, in the news, whether it was through the Derek Chauvin trial or Dante Wright. I'm just wondering sort of like, how do you put these events into a larger context of, thinking about how do we help how do we make sure to experience liberation and justice for people? We also know there was we just read about, everything that happened in Duxbury, and sort of the lack of education truly that people have around understanding difference. There's really no words for some of what we have read about and have been experiencing, unfortunately, over and over again. And I just, I wonder if there's things that we could look to sort of help ourselves be, for guidance or understanding. I think of it more as inspiring people to, like you said, Lola Amod, not to stand, but to actually do. And think about ways that, within the Jewish community, what can we do to stand up and actually be active and do things?
So this first piece, I'm thinking, is that inspiring? I don't know if it's inspiring so much as it gives me comfort. Because this has been like such a hard week. I can't believe that these things are happening. And even, with, Adam Toledo, Alava Shalom, like, I was like, wow, he was 13 years old. Like
I know.
Just barely a bar mitzvah, and it's just so heavy. So I just recently learned this Torah, this teaching that earthly justice can never be fully just because it lacks a complete perspective. And so, this is, people are people, right? And we only have what we're coming with and what we know. And, we're socialized to believe things. We know certain things. We don't know certain things. Like, that's just the nature of the human experience. So earthly justice can never be fully just. And, the text was essentially saying, because God, right? God has that view of everything, is able to hold the whole. And if it's divine justice, it's fully measured, and it's as just, it's pure justice. But what we experience here isn't that. It is, coming through the vehicle of human beings. So it's necessarily flawed or unwhole. So that's been really giving me comfort. Like, we are humans, right? Like all we can do is ask humans to be humans, just like that fantastic opening quote, right? Like the most we can do is be human, and that is imperfect. It's like it's part of the territory.
Yeah. I'm the head of a day school, and I take that as a very serious responsibility. And what can our parents and what can we as teachers, what are the tools that we can make sure that we're giving our children? I think about it a lot. I'm very proud of the diversity that we have at our school. We still are here in, Marblehead, Swampscott, and even though which is not the most diverse community by any means, but I think the things that we do and what we teach about, whether it's the books and the authors we read, whether it's the stories we tell of people who aren't the mainstream story, I just wonder, do you have any specific recommendations or things to help parents or grandparents and educators, in terms of helping our children make sure they go out into the world with their eyes wide open, and aware of the matrix, not being sort of blinded that way?
Yeah, I think representation is key. I think about a lot of the hate that, is going on in the world, and thinking about anti-Semitism and people hating Jews who've never met Jews, right? Like as parents and teachers, creating a world that's full of diversity, even if there's no one else in the town, who looks differently from them, but helping them understand that like there's a world outside of this town, outside of this whatever, because these people exist, right? So that's not a shock when people encounter people who think differently or have different customs. I think something that's really important is to understand that anti-Semitism is a pillar of white supremacy, that the point of white supremacy and like the point of the Holocaust as well was about homogeneity, and trying to create, one way of being. And so, this fight against anti-racism is the fight as well against anti-Semitism. It's a fight for people to just exist in different ways and be valued and have those different ways add to the richness of the human experience and not detract from some ideal of singular oneness of the human experience, not the God experience. And I think we need to help our students and our children understand themselves, right? What it means to be an American, what it means to be Jewish to them. What does it mean to be white? Like what comes along with all of those terms? And I should say, like, what's really important is approaching all of these topics in a developmentally appropriate way.
Of course.
Like I think sometimes we get really impassioned about things, and then we want to like let our kids know about all these things. It's like, they're not ready to process that yet.
Right. That's so true.
Yeah.
So true. I'm going to try, we have a lot of questions that came from the audience, but I'm going to start off with one, and then we'll see how many we have time for. So I'm just reading this from in here. It says, our values make us want to be an inclusive Jewish community, yet people of color are vastly, as you said, underrepresented in our synagogues, our day schools, and other organizations. So how can Jews who live in predominantly white areas or Jewish communities that have been historically racially homogeneous, like the North Shore, so how can we begin to expand connections to the broader diversity of the Jewish community and make people of color feel welcome, whether Jewish or otherwise, for them to feel comfortable, in our synagogue setting, in our homes, in our communities? What are the things that we can do?
It's a great question. I think that's the question a lot of people are wondering. I think the work starts with the individuals that make up the synagogues and organizations and institutions, right? People often think about like, how do we change society, or what are we going to do about the government or whatever? But all of those things are made up of individuals, right? So individuals have to do this work for themselves. Truly, everything we were just talking about giving to the kids, we as adults have to be models for it, right? We have to be asking these questions. We have to be, making sure that we're taking in resources from varied places, that our Jewish experience is a diverse Jewish experience. And sort of like getting rid of the idea of welcome, right? Like I welcome people into my home because it's my home, right? I still set the rules. You take your shoes off and like I set the rules. But with Jews of color, like it's not about welcome, right? It's our home too.
Right.
So it's about how do we send the message that Jews of color belong in our synagogue. I've seen it done, or our organizations, I've seen it done really well at some synagogues, like right on their pages. And I should go back and say like, this also ties into how it's not just about race, because if a trans person is coming in the door, a trans Jew, they also belong, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how is your community saying that without saying it, right? Because words, how are they acting that all Jews belong in that space?
Yeah, it reminds me very much of being able to just, have a flag, have the rainbow flag like up in your door. Like, my school, all the doorways have, have the rainbow as a sticker on them. And like, that means that, and it says everyone welcome. And that's all it says, right?
Yeah.
But that like is just disarming for people, because then they know I'm okay here. Like, this is a place I can be myself no matter, sort of how they are experiencing their gender, right? Like it's a place that's welcome for all. And those are things we can do. I hear you're saying is both in the, sort of in the unspoken ways are actually more powerful than the spoken ways, as sort of like breaking down those barriers. So another question that we got, many people were asking, saying that there are sometimes strains in the relationships between the Black and the Jewish communities. And you spoke about that even within your own experience with family members at Thanksgiving. And what are the factors that you think have eroded the positive connections between Black and Jewish communities?
Run to my bookshelf.
Okay. I was gonna say, are there divisions within the Jewish community itself? Like, do you see some Jewish communities more open than others? And, how does that affect the way we deal with some of this?
So, nothing ever happens in a vacuum. Like even thinking about my current educational experience, I had to go back to like school integration. So in thinking about the relationship between Black, I'm assuming non-Jewish communities and white Jewish communities, there's a great book called Black Power, Jewish Politics by Professor Mark Dollinger. And so he looks at civil rights. And, that moment when there used to be such a close connection between, Black and Jewish communities. And, something interesting that, I understood from his book, it's like in the Jewish community, there's pictures of Heschel marching with Dr. King, right? Holding the Torah. People have those pictures in their homes or in their office or whatever. Those pictures don't exist in the Black community. No one's like, hey, remember that time when Heschel marched with King? You know what I mean? So like, we just have a different perspective of the relationship and the impact of the relationship. So this book was a really interesting study on like, how are we thinking? How is our thinking different from Black people's non-Jewish community thinking around like what we were working towards for civil rights? And so, yeah. And I think like thinking critically about that moment can help inform the moment that we're in.
Yeah. So I think I guess one other question I'll follow up on that's related to this, that was in the chat too, was just sort of mentioning this sort of this struggle between the Black Lives Matter movement and people's initial feelings about whether or not it was also anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and like, how can you, sort of like bridge those two? And I don't know if there's anything you could comment on about that as well.
Sure. What I understood is that the Movement for Black Lives platform was calling out the racism against Black people in Israel, which is a reality. And I think it's a challenge because like we love Israel, like, and I love Israel. We were just celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut this week. And I think we tend to think about Israel as a place of perfection, and we don't call out the truths of Israel. And part of Ahavat Yisrael, the way I understand this mitzvah, is sort of the same way I look at loving America. Like, I live here, I love it, I stand by it, and I'm completely critical because I have a voice and I'm going to use it. And since it stands for me, I feel like I need to be involved in what it stands for. And the same is true of Israel, right? Like, even if a Jewish person had no care in the world about Israel, we're still connected to the state of Israel, right? So there are a lot of things that are happening to brown Jews in Israel. There are a lot of things that are happening to African refugees in Israel. And we all know there are things that are happening to Palestinians in Israel that are the reality. And I think as Jews, we should be asking the question instead of getting upset, or we can get upset. There's room for both feelings, right? But after we get upset, then asking the questions. Now, why could someone draw a comparison between the systemic racism in America and the problems in Israel? What's going on in Israel, and where do we as Jews need to shine a light of concern in Israel, our homeland, the land that we care about and send money to and all of that stuff? What's going on there, and how can we affect change there?
Yeah, it's hard. And I love what you said, that I often use the same term. I did a lot of study about teaching about Israel, and there's this idea that you have to both like wrestle with Israel and you also have to hug Israel. It's like, it's not one or the other. It's got to be hugging and wrestling, and that's like the work of Robbie Greengrass. He's done a ton of sort of research about this. And I think that's the case, right? Like, we can't be so sort of polarized in our view that it's one or the other. And in thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, it came out of its own need and sort of looks at things that it's not one extreme way or the other, right? That we have to look at the place we live in, and no place is perfect. And
Yeah,
we're all striving to try to find a place where we can live, with great respect for everyone's differences. And this has been such a pleasure, Rav Tiferet. I feel like we could talk for another hour, but I want to be respectful of your time. And it's been a fascinating conversation today. And I want to thank you for everything that, for sharing your Torah with us, for sharing your experiences with us, and for being present and helping teach. Really. And it's been my pleasure to be in conversation with you.
my pleasure too.
Good. I'm going to turn it over to Barbara, and she is going to wrap us up for this event.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you, Rabbi. Alan
Awesome.
and I we were sitting here going, yes. It was just so inspiring and more than we could have hoped for. So thank you so much. Thank you both for leading us in this thoughtful spiritual discussion. And of course, our heartfelt gratitude to Rabbi Michael, Rabbi Tiferet Berenbaum, and Amy Gold for participating this afternoon, as well as to all of our speaker series committee members, Jerry and Patricia Kreitzer, Keiko Zoll, Joel Green, Mimi Nelson Oliver, and Bev Kahn, who helped make this event possible. A special thank you to Barry Stein for all her hard work to make this series happen.
Please join us for our final installment in our speaker series on Tuesday, April 27th at 7:30 p.m., where we'll discuss racial justice, local perspectives, local impact, with the Reverend Dr. Andre Bennett as our guest speaker, moderated by our own Tzedek LaKol committee member and former Vermont State Legislator Jerry Kreitzer. Please visit shirathayam.org to learn more and register for our final event in this series. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great evening.
Good night, everyone.